The stiff, cheap paper of the eviction notice felt like ice against Elena's trembling fingers. It was the only sound in the suffocating silence of the two-room apartment, a crinkle that echoed like a gunshot in the dead of night. A cold dread, heavy and metallic like the taste of blood, pooled in her stomach. She could feel the grimy linoleum floor through her thin socks, its chill seeping into her bones. The air was thick with the smell of poverty, a mix of stale cooking oil, dampness, and the faint, sweet scent of her sleeping children in the next room. 3 days. The stark, red letters screamed the deadline at her. 3 days until they were on the street. Her heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs, a desperate drumbeat counting down to utter ruin. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the image of the notice was burned onto the back of her eyelids. A final sound, brutal verdict. A wave of nausea rose in her throat, hot and acidic. She was 42 years old, and her life was over. She spread her entire net worth on the scarred surface of the kitchen table. The metallic clink of the last few coins was a pathetic sound, $7.35. Beside them lay 3 crumpled $100 bills and a few smaller ones, $350. That was it. The final sum of a life disassembled and sold. The money from her wedding ring, a smooth gold band she hadn't taken off in 15 years, was already gone, spent on the last month's rent. A tremor ran through her hand as she reached for the bills, the paper feeling fragile, impossible. She could feel a phantom weight on her finger where the ring used to be, a constant, agonizing reminder of her husband, of his warm smile and the future that had been stolen from them. Her stomach ached with a hunger that had become her constant companion, but the thought of food made her want to vomit. This wasn't just money. It was their last line of defense, a pathetically thin wall against the cold, unforgiving world, and it wasn't enough. A soft cough echoed from the other room. Leo, her 10-year-old son, the sound, wet and weak, sent a fresh stab of guilt through her heart. He'd had that cough for 2 weeks, and she couldn't afford the medicine to make it go away. In the dim light filtering from the street, she could see the lump on the sofa that was her 6-year-old daughter, Mia, a small chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of innocent sleep. A surge of fierce, protective love washed over Eleanor, so powerful it almost brought her to her knees, but it was immediately followed by a crushing wave of failure. Her chest tightened, a physical pain, as if a steel band were squeezing her lungs. How could she have let it come to this? They deserved a warm bed, full bellies, a life without fear. Instead, she had given them this cold, damp room, and a future that was evaporating like mist. Silent tears, hot and shameful, began to trace cold paths down her cheeks. It all came back to a single phone call. The memory was so vivid, she could almost smell the sterile, antiseptic scent of the hospital waiting room where she'd heard the news. The memory of the company lawyer's voice, smooth and devoid of any human warmth, droning on about unfortunate accidents and pending investigations as he explained why the insurance payout, their only lifeline, was being contested. The company her husband had given 20 years of his life to. They called his death a tragedy, but they treated it like an accounting problem. Her gaze fell on her old sewing machine, gathering dust in the corner. It was a monument to a different life, a time when her hands were always busy, creating, fixing, providing. Now, her hands were just empty and cold. A boiling rage, impotent and suffocating, churned in her gut. They had taken her husband. Now they were taking his children's future. It was a slow, methodical murder of hope. The distant wail of a siren cut through the night, a sound that seemed to mirror the scream trapped in her own throat. The world had shrunk to the 4 walls of this apartment, and even they were about to be taken away. Hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. It had bled out of her, leaving only a terrifying, hollow void. She felt utterly, completely alone. A tiny, sinking ship in a vast, indifferent ocean. Desperation was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, forcing the air from her lungs. She was drowning in the silence, with nothing to hold on to. Her world was collapsing and there was no one to catch her. What would you do if you had only 3 days and $300 to save your family from the streets? If you want to discover the choice Elena is forced to make sure you subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what happens next. The flickering blue light of her cheap, Cracked phone screen was the only star in her suffocatingly dark universe. It was 3 a.m, and sleep was a distant country she could no longer visit. Her thumb scrolled numbly through endless streams of useless information, a frantic, mindless motion to keep the panic at bay. Then an ad. The letters were small, blurry. Blind auction, property, 7B, derelict industrial park. Her finger paused. The words that followed sent a jolt, a tiny, dangerous spark through the cold ash of her despair. Abandoned mechanic's garage, contents included, believed to be full of scrap metal. The price was a cruel twist of fate, $300. A wave of dizziness washed over her. It was a ludicrous idea, a wild, reckless gamble. But the image of Leo's weak cough and Mia's trusting face flashed in her mind. Scrap metal had value. Copper, steel. It could be worth hundreds, maybe even 1,000. It could be a lifeline, just for another month. The thought was a dangerous seed taking root in the barren soil of her desperation. Her heart began to pound, a frantic, irregular beat against her ribs. She could almost feel the phantom weight of the $300 in her hand. It was everything. To risk it all on a blurry photo and a few lines of text was madness. Her rational mind screamed at her, listing the 100 ways this could go wrong. But what was the alternative? The street, the cold, unforgiving pavement, the shame of a shelter. She felt the icy grip of that future on her spine, and it was far more terrifying than any gamble. The words, full of scrap metal, echoed in her head, morphing from a simple description into a desperate prayer. She imagined herself hauling bags of copper wire, selling them for cash, the beautiful sound of bills being counted into her hand. The image was so powerful, so seductive, that it momentarily blotted out the crushing reality of her situation. A single tear of agonizing hope rolled down her cheek. It wasn't a plan, it was a Hail Mary, a final, desperate lunge toward a flickering light in an endless tunnel. The decision was made not with logic, but with the raw, primal instinct of a mother protecting her young. A cold resolve settled in her stomach, pushing aside the nausea. She slipped the 3 crisp $100 bills into a worn envelope, the paper feeling both as heavy as lead and as fragile as a butterfly's wing. The click of the envelope's clasp sounded like a gavel falling, sealing their fate. The next morning, she didn't tell the children where they were going. She just said it was an adventure. She held their small, warm hands, Leo's grip weak from his lingering sickness, Mia's full of unquestioning trust. The feeling of their skin against hers was both a comfort and a torment. A wave of love, so fierce it was painful, tightened her chest. She forced a smile, a brittle mask that felt like it might crack at any moment. She was leading them into the unknown, betting their entire world on a ghost of a chance. The guilt was a physical weight, a stone in her gut, but she pushed it down. Hope, however foolish, was the only fuel she had left to run on. The bus ride was a journey into another world. The familiar sounds of the city, the traffic, the chatter, the distant music, gradually faded, replaced by the rhythmic groan and rattle of the ancient vehicle. They were the only passengers left as the bus rumbled past the last of the neat suburban houses and into a landscape of forgotten industry. The air that filtered through the rattling windows changed, losing the scent of exhaust and fast food, and taking on a metallic, damp smell, the odor of decay. Elena's stomach churned, the knot of anxiety tightening with every mile. She stared out at the passing scenery, rows of warehouses with shattered windows like vacant eyes, fences topped with rusted barbed wire, and weeds reclaiming the cracked pavement. A profound silence began to settle, a dead quiet that felt unnatural, heavy. It was the silence of a place that time had abandoned. Her forced smile for the children grew more strained. The fragile hope she'd been clutching began to feel thin and frayed, like old thread. They disembarked into a world of grey and rust. The bus pulled away with a hydraulic sigh, leaving them utterly alone in the oppressive silence, broken only by a low, mournful whistle of wind whipping through the skeletal remains of the buildings. The industrial park was a graveyard of ambition. Every structure was a monument to failure, their brick facades crumbling, their metal siding bleeding orange rivers of rust down to the ground. Elena's heart began a slow, heavy thud of dread. This wasn't just old, it was dead. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold air traced its way up her spine. She clutched the piece of paper with the address, her knuckles white. Her gaze scanned the row of decaying structures, each one more derelict than the last. Then she saw it. Number 7B. It was worse than she could have possibly imagined. The hopeful image from the ad dissolved into this brutal reality, and she felt a sickening lurch in her gut, the feeling of falling from a great height. The garage was a carcass. It wasn't just abandoned, it was collapsing. A large section of the roof had caved in, leaving a gaping wound open to the sky. The main garage door, a huge roll-up of corrugated metal, was mangled and half off its tracks, frozen in a permanent, twisted grimace. The smaller side door, their only way in, hung crookedly from a single, groaning hinge. Weeds and sickly-looking vines clawed their way up the stained brick walls as if nature itself were trying to drag the building back into the earth. The optimistic phrase, "mechanic's garage," evaporated, replaced by the stark reality of a ruin. Elena felt the air leave her lungs in a choked gasp. The $300 she'd spent felt like a physical wound. A hole burned right through her. Leo coughed beside her, a small wet sound that echoed in the deathly quiet. The sound sliced through her, a fresh wave of guilt and failure so intense it made her vision swim. This wasn't a lifeline, it was a tombstone for her last hope. With a trembling hand, she pushed on the crooked side door. It protested with a long, agonizing shriek of rusted metal, a sound that grated on her nerves and seemed to mock her foolishness. The moment the door opened, the smell hit them. It was a thick, gagging stench, a physical presence that filled her nose and mouth. The overwhelming aroma of damp, creeping mold mixed with the sour, pungent odor of rat droppings and the metallic tang of decay. It was the smell of rot, of years of neglect sealed in darkness. Elena instinctively put an arm in front of her children, trying to shield them, but the smell was everywhere, clinging to the air, to their clothes. She felt a wave of nausea so powerful, she had to brace herself against the doorframe. Her stomach, already aching with hunger, clenched violently. This wasn't the smell of potential profit. This was the smell of a grave. The last vestiges of her desperate fantasy were being suffocated by the foul, unbreathable air of her mistake. Her eyes struggled to adjust to the gloom inside, pierced only by a few weak shafts of light from the hole in the roof. What she saw made her heart plummet into an abyss of despair. The scrap metal she had gambled everything on was a cruel joke. It wasn't valuable copper, aluminum, or steel. It was junk. Piles of worthless, rusted-out detritus lay scattered across the damp concrete floor. There were heaps of corroded exhaust pipes, shattered engine blocks that were more rust than metal, and twisted, unidentifiable pieces of machinery that looked like the mangled bones of prehistoric animals. A small, frantic scuttling sound echoed from a dark corner, followed by a squeak. Rats! The sound sent a fresh tremor of revulsion through her. She felt the grimy, damp floor through the thin soles of her shoes. This wasn't a treasure trove. It was a landfill. It would cost more to have this garbage hauled away than it was worth. The full, crushing weight of her idiocy landed on her. She had spent their last dollars on trash. Leo, either oblivious to the despair radiating from his mother or trying to make the best of it, let go of her hand. "Wow," he whispered, his voice echoing in the cavernous, rotting space. He saw not a ruin but a playground of strange shapes and shadows. Before Elena could stop him, he darted deeper into the gloom, his small form navigating the piles of jagged metal with a child's careless grace. "Leo, be careful," she called out, her voice tight with panic. The thought of him getting cut on a piece of rusted metal, of an infection she couldn't afford to treat, sent a fresh spike of terror through her. Her gaze swept the room again desperately, as if looking hard enough would somehow transform the worthless junk into something of value, but there was nothing, just decay and filth. The drip, drip, drip of water from the ruined roof into a dark, oily puddle on the floor was the only sound, a steady, maddening metronome counting out the seconds of her failure. Her legs felt weak, her whole body trembling with the shock of her monumental error. In the center of the garage, under the largest part of the sagging roof, sat a huge, hulking shape shrouded by a thick, filthy tarp. It was the only thing that seemed deliberately covered. For one insane, fleeting moment, a spark of hope dared to flicker again. A classic car, a vintage truck, something that, even in disrepair, might have some value to a collector. The thought was so absurd it was almost painful, yet she clung to it. It was the last straw, the final desperate lottery ticket. Her hands were shaking as she approached it, the sound of her own ragged breathing loud in the silence. The tarp was stiff with age and grime, and it took all her strength to get a grip on the coarse fabric. The material felt cold and damp under her fingers. A fine dust, smelling of mold and dead things, rained down as she began to pull. The sound of the tarp scraping against the object beneath was a rough, rasping noise, like a final, drawn-out breath. She braced herself, her heart hammering, caught between terror and a sliver of impossible hope. She yanked the tarp with a final, desperate heave. It came away with a tearing sound, revealing the vehicle beneath, and the last flicker of hope died, snuffed out completely and forever. It wasn't a valuable classic. It was a corpse, a massive, boat-like sedan from the 1970s, its once proud body now a landscape of cancerous rust. Deep orange blooms of corrosion had eaten through the panels, leaving gaping holes that exposed the decaying interior. The chrome trim was pitted and peeling, the windows were shattered, and the tires had long since rotted away, leaving the car to sag onto the greasy floor on its rusted wheel rims. It was an icon of decay, a monument to hopelessness. It was the most worthless thing in a garage full of worthless things. Elena felt something inside her snap. It was a quiet internal sound, the sound of a spirit breaking. She stared at the automotive carcass, and all the fight, all the desperation, all the adrenaline that had been keeping her upright, simply drained away. The crushing realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. $300 gone, wasted on this tomb. The money that could have bought food, or Leo's medicine, or at the very least, a few more days in their apartment before the eviction. She had thrown it away. She had taken her children's last chance at security and set it on fire. A low, guttural sob escaped her throat, a sound of pure, animalistic grief. Her knees buckled. She didn't so much fall as crumple, sinking onto the cold, filthy concrete floor amidst the debris of her shattered hopes. The sharp edge of a rusted piece of metal dug into her leg, but she didn't feel the pain. The only thing she could feel was the immense, suffocating weight of her failure. The dampness of the floor began to seep through her jeans, a cold that mirrored the absolute zero that had overtaken her heart. She was done. There were no more plans, no more gambles, no more desperate hopes. There was only this cold, dark place and the absolute certainty of her ruin. Her body was racked with silent, convulsive sobs. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the grime on her cheeks. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold the pieces of her broken world together, but it was impossible. She was adrift in a black ocean of despair, with no land in sight. She had not only failed to save her family, she had actively steered them into the rocks. The thought was an agony beyond words. The sound of Leo's voice, small and curious, barely penetrated the thick fog of her misery. He was somewhere in the dark, playing. The trust in that sound was a knife in her heart. How could she ever face him? How could she tell him that their adventure was a catastrophic mistake, that his mother had just gambled away their last chance at a home? The shame was a burning acid in her throat. She felt hollowed out, scoured clean of everything but pain and self-loathing. This was the bottom, a place of cold floors, the smell of rot, and the deafening silence of absolute failure. She had dragged her children to this desolate, forgotten place to watch their future die. The weight of her husband's absence had never felt heavier. He would have known what to do. He would have been strong, practical. He wouldn't have made such a foolish, desperate mistake. A fresh wave of grief washed over her, so powerful it stole her breath. She was alone, utterly and completely alone, and she had failed everyone who had ever depended on her. The silence of the garage pressed in, broken only by the steady, mocking drip of water and the sound of her own choked breaths. The world had shrunk to this single, horrifying moment. There was no tomorrow, no next week, no putting off the eviction. There was only the cold concrete beneath her, the stench of decay in her nostrils, and the icy, paralyzing grip of rock bottom. She closed her eyes, wishing the darkness would swallow her whole. The hope was false. The ruin was real, and she was lost. And then, a small sound cut through the oppressive stillness. It wasn't the drip of water or the scuttling of rats. It was a metallic clink, A small, sharp, heavy sound coming from the direction of the rusted-out car. Elena's head lifted slowly, her tear-filled eyes struggling to focus in the gloom. "Mom?" It was Leo's voice, no longer playful, but tinged with a note of confusion. "Mom, look, I found something." The words barely registered, lost in the roar of her own despair. Another mistake, another piece of junk. She wanted to tell him to leave it, to come away from the metallic carcass that represented her ultimate failure. But the boy's voice held a different quality now, a note of genuine discovery. In the near darkness of the derelict garage, surrounded by the wreckage of her last foolish hope, a new sound had just entered the world, and Elena had no way of knowing that this small, insignificant noise was about to change everything. Elena didn't move. The cold of the concrete floor was now a familiar numbness that seemed to have crept into her very soul. Leo's voice was a distant echo, a sound from a world she no longer belonged to. "Mom, are you okay? Look." He was persistent. She heard the scuff of his worn sneakers on the gritty floor, getting closer. A small, dirty hand touched her shoulder, a tentative, worried gesture that sent a tremor of guilt through her. "I found a box," he repeated, his voice now a soft whisper right next to her ear. A profound weariness settled over Elena. She couldn't even summon the energy to pretend. A box. Another piece of rusted junk. Another reminder of the trash heap she had bought. She wanted to tell him to throw it away, to leave her alone in her misery. But the genuine concern in his voice was a tiny anchor, pulling her, inch by inch, back from the abyss of her despair. Slowly, reluctantly, she turned her head, her neck stiff, her eyes raw and swollen from crying. He was holding it out to her. It wasn't just a piece of junk. It was small, no bigger than a brick, but Leo was holding it with both hands, his arms straining slightly. It was clearly heavy. Made of a dark, pitted metal, it was covered in grime and a film of oily residue, but it was solid, complete. There were no visible hinges or locks, just a perfectly sealed cube of dark iron. Her gaze, dull and lifeless a moment ago, sharpened with a flicker of curiosity. It wasn't a car part, it wasn't a broken tool. It had a sense of purpose, of design. It was stuck, Leo explained, his eyes wide, under the driver's seat. It was really hard to get out. Elena slowly sat up, the protest of her stiff muscles lost in this new, strange focus. She reached out with a trembling hand, not to take the box, but to touch it. The metal was cold, colder than the floor, a deep, ancient cold. Her fingers traced the edges, feeling no seam, no opening. It was a puzzle, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, her mind wasn't screaming about rent or food. It was asking a question. What is this? She finally took the box from Leo's hands. The weight of it surprised her, a solid, dense heft that spoke of something other than empty space. Her fingers, stained with grease and dirt, explored its surface. Searching for a clue, her thumb brushed against a small, almost invisible indentation on one side. A button, a release. Her heart gave a small, unexpected flutter. She pressed it. There was no click, just a subtle internal shift, and then a faint hissing sound like a release of pressure. A thin line appeared down the center of the box. It was a lid. With her fingernails, she pried it open. The two halves came apart with a smooth, satisfying resistance, revealing an interior lined with faded red velvet. The sight was so unexpected, so out of place in this grimy tomb, that Elena gasped. The velvet was stained and worn, but it was unmistakably a lining for something precious, and nestled in the center of that faded crimson was not a pile of gold or jewels, but two simple, baffling objects. Her mind was reeling. The first was a key. It was made of tarnished brass, the once bright metal now a dull, greenish-brown. It was an old-fashioned skeleton key, ornate and heavy, the kind you saw in movies about haunted mansions. It felt solid and real in her palm, its weight a strange comfort. She could feel the intricate cuts of the bit against her fingertips, a complex pattern that promised to unlock something specific, something important. A tiny, almost imperceptible spark of electricity seemed to jump from the metal into her skin. Next to the key, lying on the worn velvet, was a small, folded piece of paper. It was yellowed with age, brittle and fragile. Elena picked it up with a reverence she didn't understand, her fingers clumsy and thick. She unfolded it carefully. the paper threatening to crumble at her touch. The ink was faded, a pale brown against the yellowed background, the handwriting a spidery, elegant script. It contained only 6 words that made the hair on her arms stand on end. "The weight is in the back." Her breath caught in her throat. "The weight is in the ache." She read the words aloud, her voice a hoarse whisper that was swallowed by the cavernous space of the garage. The phrase was cryptic, nonsensical, yet it felt charged with a significance that made her skin tingle. What weight? The back of what? Her mind, which had been a fog of despair, began to work again, gears grinding slowly back to life. She looked from the note in her hand to the tarnished key, then to the vast, decaying garage around them. It was a riddle, a clue left by someone, long ago, in this specific place. The despair hadn't vanished, but it was now joined by something else, a powerful and unfamiliar feeling. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was intrigue, a deep, consuming curiosity that momentarily eclipsed the gnawing hunger in her stomach and the crushing weight of her failure. A new path had opened in the darkness, and while she didn't know where it led, it was the first path she'd seen in a very long time. It was a thread, and she had to pull on it. A sudden, absurd thought struck her. The car, the monstrous, rusted-out hulk that had been the symbol of her ultimate failure. Was it possible? She looked at the ornate key in her hand. It was clearly a car key, but from a different era. Perhaps this key fit the ignition. Maybe the weight was some hidden feature, something inside the car itself. A jolt of nervous energy shot through her. It was a wild, illogical leap, but it was the only connection she had. "Leo, stay here," she commanded, her voice gaining a new, firm edge. She stood up, her legs still trembling, but this time with anticipation, not weakness. She moved towards the driver's side of the decaying sedan, her heart thudding a strange, syncopated rhythm against her ribs. The driver's door hung open on a single, groaning hinge. The interior of the car smelled even worse than the garage, a putrid combination of mildew, decaying upholstery, and the faint, coppery scent of old rust. She ignored it all, her eyes fixed on the steering column and the ignition switch. The keyhole was there, a small, dark circle in the rusted dashboard. Her hand was shaking as she brought the brass key towards it. This was it. This had to be it. She could almost feel the engine rumbling to life, a miraculous resurrection. She imagined headlights cutting through the gloom, revealing a hidden compartment filled with something that would solve everything. The key slid into the ignition and stopped. It didn't fit, it wasn't even close. She pushed, jiggled it, twisted it, but the brass key was too large, the wrong shape entirely. It clattered uselessly against the metal. A wave of familiar disappointment washed over her, cold and bitter. Of course it wasn't that easy. Nothing was ever easy. She felt the tears welling up again, the brief flicker of excitement dissolving back into the familiar, crushing despair. It was just another dead end, another cruel joke in this house of failures. The key was meaningless. The note was meaningless. It was all just more trash in a garage full of it. She slumped against the car's rusted frame, the cold metal biting into her back through her thin shirt. She was a fool, a complete and utter fool, to have allowed herself even a moment of this ridiculous fantasy. She stared at the faded note in her hand, the spidery script now seeming to mock her. "The weight is in the back." It was gibberish, the ramblings of a dead mechanic. She was about to crumple the paper in her fist, to throw it and the useless key into the darkest corner of the garage, and finally surrender to her fate. But her eyes, scanning the words one last time, caught on a detail. The way the K was written. It was sharp, angular, almost like an arrow pointing back. Her gaze lifted from the note. Following that imaginary arrow, it moved past the driver's seat, past the decaying passenger area, and settled on the solid, hulking rear of the vehicle. The trunk, a jolt, like a low-voltage electrical shock, ran up her spine. The weight is in the back, not the back seat, the back of the car. A sudden, breathtaking understanding flooded her mind. It wasn't about the engine. It wasn't about starting the car. The key wasn't for the ignition. She looked at the tarnished brass key in her hand again, seeing it now with new eyes. It was a trunk key, a heavy, old-fashioned key for a heavy, old-fashioned lock. The realization was so sudden, so brilliantly clear, that she felt a wave of dizziness. A single hysterical laugh escaped her lips, a strange, choked sound in the dead quiet of the garage. It was all starting to make sense. The heavy box, the cryptic note, the ornate key. It was a sequence, a set of instructions. Someone had gone to a great deal of trouble to hide something, and they had left a trail of breadcrumbs for someone to find it. And she, by some cosmic, cruel twist of fate, had stumbled right into the middle of it. The fear and despair were still there, lurking in the shadows of her mind, but now they were joined by a fierce, burning urgency. She had to open that trunk. She scrambled to the rear of the car, her movements now filled with a frantic energy. The back of the sedan was a mess of rust and peeling paint, but in the center was a round, dark circle. The lock. It was covered in a thick crust of orange corrosion, sealed shut by decades of rain and neglect. She tried the key, her heart pounding. With a shaking hand, she inserted the tip into what she hoped was the keyhole. It wouldn't go in. The rust was too thick, forming a solid barrier. A surge of raw frustration, born of desperation, coursed through her. To be this close, to have the key in her hand, and to be blocked by something as mundane as rust, it was unbearable. She felt a scream of rage building in her throat. She would not be stopped. Not now, not by this. She yanked the key out and stared at the sealed lock with a new, feral determination. If the key wouldn't work, she would find another way. This trunk was going to open, even if she had to tear the car apart with her bare hands. A fire she thought long extinguished was now burning white-hot in her veins. Her eyes scanned the chaotic mess of the garage floor, no longer seeing junk, but an arsenal of possibilities. The piles of rusted metal that had been a symbol of her failure now looked like a hardware store. Her gaze landed on a long, heavy piece of iron sticking out from a pile of debris. A crowbar. It was rusted and heavy, but it was solid. Hope, raw and powerful, surged through her. She grabbed it. The cold, rough iron a perfect fit for the anger and determination in her hands. The weight of it was reassuring, a promise of leverage, of force. She returned to the trunk. The crowbar feeling like a weapon, an extension of her will. She wedged the flattened tip of the crowbar into the narrow gap between the trunk lid and the car's body. The fit was tight. She put her shoulder into it, pushing all her weight, all her frustration, all her desperate hope into that single point of contact. The metal of the car groaned in protest, a long, drawn-out screech that echoed through the silent garage and set her teeth on edge. She heaved again, and again, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Sweat beaded on her forehead and trickled into her eyes, stinging them. Her muscles screamed in protest, the unfamiliar strain burning in her arms and back. The crowbar slipped, scraping loudly against the car and taking a chunk of rusted metal and paint with it. A sharp edge cut her hand, and she felt a warm trickle of blood run down her wrist, but she didn't even register the pain. Her entire world had narrowed to this single monumental task. There was only the car, the crowbar, and the sealed secret within. She jammed the crowbar back into the gap, finding a better purchase this time. She took a deep breath, planted her feet, and threw her entire body into one final desperate push. There was a sudden, violent crack, a sound like a bone snapping. It was so loud, so explosive in the silence, that both she and Leo flinched. The lock had broken. The trunk lid, freed from its decades-long prison, popped upward a few inches with a final, metallic sigh. For a moment, Elena just stood there, panting, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she felt dizzy. The crowbar fell from her numb fingers, clattering onto the concrete floor. She stared at the gap in the trunk lid, a dark, mysterious opening that promised... What? For the first time, a sliver of genuine fear pierced the adrenaline. What if it was something horrible? What if she had just unleashed something she couldn't control? The possibilities, both wonderful and terrible, crowded her mind, making her head spin. She could hear Leo's small, frightened voice behind her. "Mom, what was that?" She couldn't answer. She could barely breathe. She wiped her sweaty, grimy, bloody hand on her jeans and reached for the edge of the trunk lid. The metal was sharp and rusted, but she didn't care. With a final surge of effort, she lifted, The lid was heavy, but it moved, groaning on its rusted hinges, opening like a giant metal mouth. It swung all the way open and slammed against the back of the car with a final, echoing clang. She peered into the darkness. The first thing that hit her was the smell. It wasn't the smell of mildew and rot that filled the rest of the garage. This was different. It was the dry, dusty scent of old paper, the faint, sharp smell of leather, and a heavy, earthy aroma of canvas and oil. Her eyes, slowly adjusting, saw that the trunk was full. It wasn't filled with spare tires or greasy tools. It was packed tight with what looked like a dozen large, lumpy sacks. They were made of thick, heavy-duty canvas, the color of sand, stained dark in places with oil and grime. They were tied at the top with thick, coarse rope. They looked like old mail bags or bank sacks. Her first thought was a fresh wave of disappointment. Was this the weight? A trunk full of old rags or sandbags for traction in the snow? Had she gone through all of that, broken her body and her spirit, for another pile of worthless junk? The hope that had been burning so brightly began to flicker, threatening to die out once more. But something kept her there. The sheer number of them. The way they were so carefully packed, filling every inch of the space. Her hand, still trembling, reached into the trunk. Her fingers brushed against the rough, abrasive texture of one of the canvas sacks. She grabbed the knotted rope at the top and pulled. It was far heavier than she expected. It took both hands and a grunt of effort to drag it out of the trunk and onto the grimy concrete floor. It landed with a dull, heavy thud that seemed to shake the ground. It was not filled with rags. It was not filled with sand. Whatever was inside was dense. Solid? She fumbled with the knot, her fingers clumsy with a mixture of excitement and dread. The rope was stiff and old, the knot pulled impossibly tight. Frustrated, she looked around, her eyes landing on a jagged shard of metal on the floor. She grabbed it, and without a second thought sawed at the thick rope. It frayed, and then with a snap, it gave way, and the top of the sack fell open. She peered inside. For a moment, she couldn't process what she was seeing. The sack was filled with rocks, dull, greyish, oddly shaped rocks of varying sizes, covered in a fine, dusty powder. The crushing weight of disappointment was absolute. Rocks. All that for a bag of rocks. The hysterical laugh that had escaped her earlier now threatened to turn into a sob of pure, unadulterated madness. She had lost her mind. She had spent her last dollar, terrified her children, and torn a car apart for a trunk full of landscaping rocks. She reached in and grabbed a handful, intending to hurl them against the wall in a final, futile act of rage. But as her fingers closed around them, she felt their texture. They weren't smooth like river stones. They were rough, with sharp, crystalline edges. They were strangely warm to the touch, or perhaps her own skin was just that cold. They felt greasy, almost oily, a strange density. She lifted one out of the bag and held it up to the weak shaft of light filtering down from the hole in the roof. It wasn't a rock. As the light hit its surface, it didn't just reflect it. It seemed to swallow the light and then refract it, sending out a tiny, brilliant rainbow of fire from within its dull, grey exterior. It glittered with an internal, hidden brilliance, a raw, untamed beauty. Elena's breath hitched. Her mind, reeling, struggled to name what she was holding. She had seen pictures, of course, in magazines and on television, pictures of queens and movie stars wearing polished, glittering versions of this. But this was the source. This was the raw, uncut, and infinitely more valuable form, a diamond. She wasn't holding a rock. She was holding a large, rough, uncut diamond. Her hand started to shake uncontrollably, and the stone almost slipped through her fingers. She quickly dropped it back into the sack as if it were burning hot. She looked from the sack to the trunk, which was filled with a dozen more just like it. Her mind couldn't grasp the scale of it. It was impossible. It was a dream. Stunned into a state of near paralysis, she slowly reached back into the first sack she had opened. Her fingers, numb and clumsy, brushed past the hard, angular shapes of the diamonds and touched something else. Something flat and rectangular. Something with a different texture. Soft yet firm. Leather. Her brow furrowed in confusion. Carefully, she pushed the diamonds aside and pulled the object out. It was a book, a thick, leather-bound ledger. its cover dark and stained with the same oil as the sacks. There was no title on the cover, no markings of any kind. The leather was worn smooth in places, and the corners were bent and frayed. It felt ancient, heavy with secrets. She pulled another sack toward her, this one still tied. Her hands worked with a new, frantic purpose as she sawed through the rope. More diamonds spilled out, but this time, tucked amongst them, was another ledger, identical to the first. One by one, she opened the sacks. Each was the same, a bed of rough, uncut diamonds, and nestled within, a silent, leather-bound sentinel. The world outside the garage seemed to dissolve. Elena sat on the filthy concrete, the cool iron-hard shapes of the diamonds in the open sack forgotten beside her. Her entire being was focused on the leather-bound book in her lap. It felt heavier than any of the sacks of stones, weighted not with carats, but with secrets. Her fingers, smudged with grease and her own dried blood from the crowbar, traced the worn cover. This was the true treasure. She knew it with a certainty that made her shiver. The diamonds were a fortune, but this was a story. A story somebody had gone to great lengths to bury. She could feel her heart pounding in her throat, a frantic, wild bird trapped in her chest. A wave of nausea, sharp and acidic, rose from her stomach, a physical reaction to the sheer gravity of the object she held. With a deep, shaky breath that did little to calm her, she opened the first ledger. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the ink was a dark, defiant blue, written in a hand that was chillingly neat and precise, the handwriting of a meticulous monster. The first page was dated simply May 1982. The entries that followed were a cold litany of logistics. Shipment received, 12 men, Caxias. Equipment deployed, Sector Gamma. Weekly yield, 4.8 kilograms. The words were sterile, corporate, but they sent a chill down Elena's spine. Caxias was a poor region, known for its large indigenous population. What kind of shipment involved men? What kind of equipment was being deployed in a place she knew was supposedly protected land? She felt Leo's small presence beside her, his quiet breathing a stark contrast to the roaring in her own ears. She turned the page, and the next, and the next. Each was filled with the same dispassionate accounting. Tonnage of earth moved, fuel consumed, weekly yields calculated to a precise gram. It was the ledger of a mining operation. That much was clear, but it was a clandestine one. There were no company names, no official permits, just sectors labeled with Greek letters and lists of supplies that spoke of a remote, isolated camp. A cold knot of dread began to tighten in her gut. Then she found the first list of names. It was under a heading that simply read, Accounts. Dozens of names, names she recognized as common to the local indigenous tribes, Aruan, Kayapo, Guajajara. Next to each name was a weekly payment, a pathetically small sum of money, an amount that was an insult for any kind of real labor. She ran her finger down the list, the brittle paper crinkling under her touch. These were the men in the shipments, recruited, likely with false promises, and paid a pittance for back-breaking work. She could almost picture them, young men, strong men, fathers and sons, hoping to earn enough to feed their families, lured into the jungle. Her own desperation, the memory of her husband's exploitation by his company, created an immediate, painful flicker of empathy. She knew this kind of desperation. She knew what it was to be preyed upon. A sickening feeling of familiarity washed over her. This wasn't just a business record. It was a testament to the systematic abuse of the powerless and the poor. She felt a phantom pain in her chest. She kept turning the pages, her breath held tight in her lungs. The ledger was thick, covering more than 2 years of operations. Towards the back, she found a new section. The heading was a single, terrifying word: losses. Her blood ran cold. She scanned the page, and her stomach lurched violently. The same names from the accounts pages appeared here, but this time there were no sums of money next to them. There was only a date, and a single, chilling annotation written in the same neat, precise hand: Desaparecido, disappeared. Page after page, the list grew. A man who had been paid his weekly wage on a Friday was listed as disappeared by Monday. There were notes in the margins: rock slide, fever, incident. But the sheer number of them, the relentless, steady accumulation of vanished men, told a different story. This wasn't a record of accidents. It was a kill list, a meticulous, horrifying accounting of mass murder, disguised as operational attrition. A strangled sob escaped her lips. The air was suddenly too thin to breathe. The weight of the book in her lap became immense. A tombstone. She was holding a graveyard in her hands. The diamonds, the source of her fleeting, selfish hope a moment ago, now felt obscene. They weren't a miracle. They were stained. They were soaked in the blood and sweat of these men, these ghosts listed on the brittle pages. A wave of dizziness swept over her, and she had to place a hand on the grimy floor to steady herself. The smell of mold and rot in the garage was suddenly mixed with the phantom scent of damp earth and decay, the smell of a shallow grave. The garage's owner, the mechanic, what was his name? The auction papers had said his name was Arthur. She flipped back through the pages, searching, and found it at the bottom of a summary page, a signature confirming the weekly totals. Rossi, Arturo Rossi. He wasn't just a mechanic, he was the bookkeeper of this horror. He was the one who had written Desaparecido next to a man's name and then calmly turned the page to record the next week's diamond yield. She felt a surge of rage so pure it burned the tears from her eyes. Rage at this Arthur, this monster who had lived and worked in this very spot, his hands covered in grease and blood. But as she flipped through the final pages, the narrative shifted. The neat handwriting grew shakier, more erratic. There were crossed-out entries, blots of ink. The final few pages were not lists, but rambling, paranoid sentences. He knows I kept the books. They are looking for them. Cannot let him find them. Cannot live with it. It was a confession, a spasm of guilt from a dying man. Arthur had been trapped. He had recorded the crimes, and in the end, his conscience or his fear had made him hide the evidence along with the blood money. He had built his own prison of paper and ink, and had died in it. But who was he? Who was the man Arthur was so terrified of? The answer was right there, peppered throughout the ledger, a signature of authorization on the largest expenses and land acquisitions. A single, powerful name, Alves. The name echoed in the silence of the garage, a name she recognized. Mr. Alves, the wealthy philanthropist, the man who owned half the state, whose face was always in the papers, shaking hands at charity galas, donating to hospitals and schools. It was impossible. He was a local hero, a respected elder statesman. The ledger told a different story. It detailed, in cold, factual terms, how Alves, back in the 80s, had used a combination of fraudulent documents and violent intimidation to seize vast tracts of supposedly protected indigenous land, the very land where this illegal mine had operated. He hadn't just funded the operation, he was its architect. He was the one who had signed off on the disappearance of witnesses and workers who caused trouble. The respected philanthropist was a mass murderer and a land thief. The ledgers were the only proof, the proof he had apparently been searching for over 30 years. And now it was sitting in the lap of a destitute widow in his old mechanic's garage. The full, terrifying truth of her situation crashed down on her. She hadn't just found a treasure, she had found a motive for murder. Her own murder. These books were a death sentence for Alves. He would do anything to get them back, to silence anyone who knew they existed. Her mind reeled. The eviction, the lack of food, the money, it all seemed like such a trivial problem now. She was entangled in a web of crime that stretched back decades. A crime perpetrated by one of the most powerful and ruthless men in the region. The diamonds were worthless if she was dead. Her children, a spike of pure terror, colder and sharper than any she had ever felt, pierced her heart. What had she brought them into? She instinctively pulled Leo closer, his small warm body a fragile shield against the immense, cold evil that had just entered their lives. The silence of the industrial park was no longer empty. It was menacing, filled with the ghosts of the ledger and the shadow of a living monster. Suddenly, a sound cut through the oppressive quiet. It was a sound so alien to this dead place that it felt like a gunshot, the low, confident purr of a high-performance engine. It wasn't the rattle of an old bus or the groan of a garbage truck. It was smooth, powerful, expensive. Elena's head snapped up, her eyes wide with animalistic fear. Her blood turned to ice in her veins. She listened. Frozen as the sound grew closer, the engine slowing as it navigated the potholed street of the industrial park. No one came here. The place was a graveyard. No one but someone with a specific, urgent purpose. Her hands flew, clumsy and slick with sweat, as she shoved the ledger back into the canvas sack, piling the rough diamonds on top of it, trying to hide it, to make it disappear. But it was too late. The sound was right outside. The purring engine cut off, plunging the world back into a silence that was now 1,000 times more terrifying than before. A heavy car door opened and closed with a solid, expensive thud. Footsteps. The crunch of expensive leather shoes on the gravel and broken asphalt outside the garage door, slow, deliberate, confident. Each footstep was a hammer blow against Elena's already frayed nerves. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, so loud she was sure the person outside could hear it. She scrambled backward, dragging the sack with her, trying to melt into the shadows at the back of the garage. She pulled Leo behind her, her hand clamped over his mouth, a silent plea for him to make no sound. Her entire body was a single, taut nerve, screaming at her to run, to hide, to disappear, but there was nowhere to go. The footsteps stopped directly in front of the crooked side door. For a moment, there was nothing. An eternity of silence stretched. Thick and suffocating, Elena held her breath until her lungs burned. Then, the door shrieked open on its single hinge, flooding the dark garage with the harsh afternoon light and silhouetting a tall, imposing figure in the doorway. He was in his late 60s, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his frame draped in an impeccably tailored cream-colored linen suit. He looked like he had just stepped out of a boardroom and into a nightmare, a creature of light and power in her world of shadow and decay. His face was weathered but handsome, the kind of face that graced the society pages. It was him. It was the face from the charity galas. It was Mr. Alves. He stood there for a moment, his eyes as cold and grey as a winter sky, adjusting to the gloom. The air crackled with his presence, an aura of absolute authority and menace that was more terrifying than any weapon. A thin, predatory smile touched his lips, a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Pardon the intrusion," he said, his voice smooth and cultured, a viper wrapped in silk. "I was in the area and heard my old friend Artur's property had finally been sold. I have so many fond memories of this place." His gaze swept the garage, lingering for a fraction of a second on the disturbed car and the open trunk. He took a few steps inside, his polished shoes avoiding the worst of the filth on the floor with practiced ease. He seemed not to notice the overwhelming stench of mold and decay. His eyes found Elena, huddled in the shadows with her son. He didn't seem surprised to see them. His smile widened slightly. "Ah, and you must be the new owner. A pleasure to meet you." He didn't offer a hand. "I am Antonio Alves." He let the name hang in the air, weighted with power and influence. "Listen, I know this place is a wreck. It's an eyesore. I'd like to do you a favor." He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. "I'll give you $5,000, cash, for the garage and whatever worthless junk is inside. You can take the money, walk away from this mess and never have to think about it again. It would be a clean start for you and your family." His eyes flickered toward Leo, a cold, appraising glance that made Elena's protective instincts flare like a wildfire. It wasn't an offer. It was a command. Elena's throat was dry as dust. She couldn't speak, couldn't move. The envelope in his hand was a lifeline, enough money to solve all her immediate problems. $5,000. It was a fortune. It was freedom from the eviction. It was medicine for Leo. It was food on the table for months. All she had to do was take it. All she had to do was give him the ledgers, the diamonds, the truth. All she had to do was let those men, the desaparecidos, stay buried and forgotten forever. She shook her head, a small, involuntary movement. She didn't know what she was refusing. The money, the deal, the entire situation, but the motion was instinctual. Alves's smile tightened, the warmth vanishing completely, leaving only a chilling coldness. "I see," he said softly. "A businesswoman. I respect that, but you should think carefully." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was more menacing than any shout. "I heard about your husband. A tragic accident at work. Such a terrible thing." He let the words hang in the air, a poisoned dart. The casual mention of her husband, of the accident that had destroyed her life, was a clear and unmistakable message. His eyes, hard and merciless, locked onto hers. "This is a dangerous world for a widow with 2 young children," he continued, his voice a silky threat. "Things fall, brakes fail, fires start. Unfortunate accidents happen all the time, especially to people who find themselves in places they don't belong, holding on to things that aren't theirs." He placed the envelope on a rusted oil drum near the door. "The offer is good for 24 hours, for your children's sake. I hope you make the wise choice." He turned without another word and walked out, the sunlight swallowing him as he departed. The sound of his car starting and driving away was the sound of a countdown timer being activated. A bomb had been placed in her lap, and the clock was ticking. She was left alone in the silence, her heart frozen with terror. Elena stood paralyzed, the echo of his words ringing in the dusty air. $5,000 sat on the rusted drum. A devil's bargain, a fortune that could save her family from the street, or the price of her soul and her silence. The weight of the sack in her hand felt impossibly heavy, filled with not just diamonds and paper, but with the lives of forgotten men, and a truth so dangerous it could get her and her children killed. To take the money was to become an accomplice, to let a monster walk free and spit on her own husband's memory. To refuse was to declare war on a man who could make her disappear with a single phone call, a man who had just threatened her children with a polite smile. Her desperation screamed at her to take the money and run, to survive, but the ghosts of the ledger whispered of justice. She was trapped between a hell of poverty and a hell of violence. What would you do in her place? Would you take the blood money to save your family? Or would you risk everything you have for a justice that has been buried for decades? The silence that followed Alves's departure was more terrifying than his words. It was a thick, predatory silence, pregnant with unseen eyes and unspoken threats. Elena stood frozen, her entire body a single taut nerve. The air still vibrated with the ghost of his presence, a faint, cloying scent of expensive cologne mixed with the garage's stench of decay, a smell of rot masked by power. Her gaze was locked on the envelope sitting on the oil drum, a stark white rectangle against the rust. $5,000, a fortune that could buy her food, medicine, a new apartment, a siren's song calling her to safety, to oblivion. But her hand, clutching the rough canvas of the sack, felt the hard, angular shapes of the diamonds and the sharp corners of the ledgers within. One offered a temporary escape, the other a terrible, permanent truth. Her heart, which had been hammering with terror, now felt like a block of ice in her chest. She had to choose, right now. The choice was between her children's immediate survival and the ghosts of countless murdered men. A wave of primal fear, cold and sharp, washed over her, a mother's instinct screaming a single silent word, run. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that Alves had not truly left. He was waiting. His men were watching. The 24-hour deadline was a lie, a piece of theater to maintain his civilized facade. The moment she stepped out that door, the real test would begin. Her mind, a maelstrom of panic, raced through impossible scenarios. She couldn't go home. He knew where she lived. She couldn't go to the police. A man that powerful owned the law in a town this small. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Her gaze fell on her children. Leo, his face pale and dirt-streaked, stared at her with wide, confused eyes. Mia had fallen asleep against his shoulder, her small face peaceful, oblivious to the monster who had just walked through their lives. A surge of protective fury, so potent it almost choked her, burned through the ice of her fear. He had threatened them. He had used her children as a weapon against her. In that moment, the choice was made. With a final, defiant glance at the envelope, she turned her back on it. Leaving the money was an act of war, a silent declaration. It was the only weapon she had. "Leo, Mia, wake up. We're leaving," she whispered, her voice a raw, strained thing. She slung the heavy sack over her shoulder, the weight of it a grim reminder of the burden she now carried. The diamonds and ledgers felt like a ton of bricks, pulling her down. She grabbed her children's hands, their small fingers wrapping around hers, and pulled them towards the twisted garage door. The afternoon light, which had seemed so harsh when Alves stood silhouetted against it, now felt terrifyingly exposing. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. Her own car, the beat-up old sedan that was her only asset besides the clothes on their backs, sat parked a short distance away. It looked pathetic, a wounded animal compared to the predator that had just been there, but it was their only hope of escape. She felt a cold sweat trickle down her spine as she stepped out into the open. The industrial park was a wasteland of silence. The mournful whistle of the wind was the only sound. Elena's eyes darted everywhere, scanning the rows of decaying warehouses, the shattered windows that looked like vacant eyes, the skeletal frames of rusted-out machinery. Was someone there, in a darkened doorway, behind a pile of rubble? The paranoia was a physical thing, making the skin on her neck crawl. She hurried towards her car, pulling the children along, trying to shield them with her own body. Her hand fumbled in her pocket for the keys, her fingers clumsy and numb. The metallic jingle of the keys sounded like an alarm bell in the dead quiet. A cold dread coiled in her stomach. She felt exposed, vulnerable. A mouse scurrying across an open floor with a hawk circling overhead. She reached the car, the faded paint of the door handle cold and gritty under her trembling hand. As she jammed the key into the lock, she saw it. A tiny, distant flicker of light. It was almost a kilometer away, at the very edge of the park. A single, bare bulb, a pinprick of defiant life in the vast necropolis. For a moment, she just stared. It was a coffee stall, a tiny, ramshackle kiosk, no bigger than a closet, with a small, hand-painted sign that read, Café de Joachim. It was the only sign of human activity she had seen in this entire desolate place. A man, old and stooped, was slowly packing things away, preparing to close. A surge of irrational hope, dangerous and desperate, shot through her. A witness. Someone else was here, someone who might have seen Alves's car. Her plan to simply drive away into oblivion evaporated. She needed an anchor, a piece of solid ground in this swirling nightmare. Changing course, she half ran, half stumbled towards the stall, dragging her children and the heavy sack behind her. The ground was uneven, littered with broken asphalt and weeds, and she nearly fell twice. Her lungs burned, and the strap of the sack dug a painful groove into her shoulder. The old man looked up as she approached, his face a road map of wrinkles, creasing in surprise. His eyes, though tired, were clear and sharp. They took in her disheveled appearance, the terror in her eyes, the children in tow. The old man, Joachim, said nothing at first. He simply stopped what he was doing and watched her come to a halt before his counter, panting and wild-eyed. The air around the stall was an oasis of comforting smells that stood in stark contrast to the rest of the park. The rich, dark aroma of freshly ground coffee, the sweet scent of sugar, and the warm, yeasty smell of cheap pastries. It was the smell of normalcy, of life. Joachim's gaze flickered from Elena's face to the huge, lumpy sack she dropped at her feet. He didn't ask what was in it. He just poured a dark, steaming liquid from a metal thermos into 3 small styrofoam cups. He pushed them across the worn wooden counter. "Drink," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "It has sugar." For the shock, Eleanor stared at the cups, at the steam rising in the cooling air. A simple act of kindness, so unexpected it almost broke her. Her hand shook so badly that when she picked up the cup, hot coffee sloshed over the rim, scalding her fingers. She barely felt it. The warmth seeping into her palm was a grounding force. She drank the coffee in 3 large, desperate gulps. It was brutally strong and achingly sweet, the heat of it chasing some of the icy dread from her bones. She watched her children sip theirs, their small faces pinched with confusion and fear. Joachim leaned against his counter, his arms crossed, his expression patient, waiting. He had the air of a man who had seen everything and was surprised by nothing. The silence stretched between them, not menacing like before, but expectant. Eleanor's mind was a chaotic storm. Should she trust him? Should she say anything? But the kindness in his eyes, the simple offering of coffee, broke through her defenses. Words began to spill out of her, a frantic, jumbled torrent. A man was here, a rich man. Alves. He knows I found something. He offered me money. He threatened me. My children. She gestured vaguely at the garage, then at the sack at her feet. She was making no sense, but she couldn't stop. The dam of her terror had burst, and the story was pouring out. Joachim listened without interruption, his weathered face a mask of calm. But when she said the name Alves, a flicker of something dark and ancient passed through his eyes, a change so subtle she might have missed it if she wasn't staring right at him. He pushed himself off the counter, his movements slow and deliberate, like a man whose bones ached with memory. He walked around the stall and picked up the heavy sack, testing its weight with a grunt. He didn't open it. He just looked at Elena, his gaze intense, searching. "Arthur's garage," he said, the name a statement, not a question. I knew he had something hidden there, always suspected it. Arthur was a weak man, caught between fear and greed. He paused, his eyes fixed on hers. "What did you find? Not just what is in this bag. What did the papers say?" The question hung in the air, sharp and precise. He wasn't just a coffee vendor. He knew there were papers. He had been waiting. Eleanor felt a shiver run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. This man was part of the story. The dam broke completely. Seeing the knowledge in his eyes, Eleanor no longer held back. The words tumbled out, detailing the ledgers, the coded language of the mining operation, the protected land, the list of names. She spoke of the heading, losses, and the chilling, repeated word, desaparecido. As she spoke, she watched Joaquim's face transform. The calm mask crumbled, revealing a landscape of profound ancient grief. His jaw tightened, and a muscle twitched in his cheek. His clear eyes seemed to look past her, into a memory that was 30 years old, but as fresh as an open wound. The sweet smell of coffee was gone, replaced by the metallic scent of her own fear. She was breathing heavily, her story finished. The terrible facts laid bare between them in the failing light. The industrial park was sinking into twilight, the long shadows of the ruined buildings stretching like grasping fingers. Joaquim was silent for a long time, his gaze lost in the distance. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with an emotion that had been buried for decades. "Isaias," he whispered, the name a prayer, a curse. "My brother." His name was Isaias. The name hung in the cold air, a ghost given substance. "He was 21, Joaquim continued, his voice now a low, ragged whisper, the sound of a heart breaking all over again. "Alves came to our village. He promised good pay, a real job. Isaias was strong. He wanted to help our family. He went with them. We got one letter, full of hope. Then nothing." He looked at Elena, and she saw not just grief in his eyes, but a burning, unextinguished fire of hatred. "They told us there was a bus crash. No survivors, no bodies. They were all just gone. But I never believed it. I knew Alves was a snake." He kicked at a loose piece of gravel, his movements suddenly angry, violent. "I came here, to this place, after I heard Arthur the mechanic died. I set up this stall, selling coffee to ghosts, just waiting for someone to open that garage. I knew Arthur was the bookkeeper. I knew the proof had to be in there. I've been waiting 30 years for you, Elena." The revelation was a physical shock. She wasn't an intruder in this story. She was its catalyst, the key Joaquim had been waiting for to unlock his own lifetime of pain and suspicion. He took a deep, shaky breath, composing himself, the old, patient man returning, but with a new, steely edge. "You cannot go home," he stated, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "You cannot go to the police. Alves owns this whole region. He has judges in his pocket and killers on his payroll. Your house will be the first place they look." He grabbed a greasy napkin from his counter and a small unstubby pencil. He scribbled a name and an address, his hand surprisingly steady. "Dr. Arantes, a human rights lawyer in the city. She is one of the few people I trust. She has fought Alves before. She is your only chance." He pressed the fragile piece of paper into her hand. It felt as heavy as the ledgers. "You must go there, now. Do not stop. Do not talk to anyone else." As he spoke, a new sound cut through the evening air. It wasn't the refined purr of Alves's luxury car. This was a low, guttural rumble. The sound of a heavy-duty truck or an old, powerful van with a bad muffler. The noise grew louder, closer. Two beams of light sliced through the twilight, sweeping across the decaying facades of the warehouses. They were coming back. "They're here," Joaquim breathed, his voice tight with urgency. The calm mask was gone, replaced by a sharp, focused alertness. He didn't wait. He knew you wouldn't take the money. The truck's engine growled as it turned down the street towards the garage. They weren't being subtle anymore. This wasn't a threat. It was a collection. Panic, white-hot and absolute, seized Eleanor. Her legs felt like they were made of water. She was going to be sick. "Get in your car. Now," Joachim commanded, his voice a whip crack that cut through her paralysis. He shoved the heavy sack of diamonds and ledgers into her arms. "Go. I will call you. Put your phone on. Leave it on." He pushed her, hard, towards her car. "Leo, Mia, with your mother, quickly." The children, terrified by the sudden panic in the adults' voices, scrambled after her, Mia starting to cry. Elena fumbled for her keys again, her fingers slick with a new, cold sweat. The truck had stopped, blocking the main path out of the industrial park, its headlights painting the front of Arthur's garage in a harsh, interrogating glare. Two large, dark figures emerged from the truck. They were just silhouettes against the powerful headlights, but their size and the way they moved, with a heavy, predatory confidence, spoke of violence. They weren't lawyers. They were thugs. They started walking towards the garage, their mission clear. Eleanor finally managed to get the door of her old car open, shoving the children into the back seat. "Get down! Stay down!" she hissed, her voice trembling. She threw the sack onto the passenger seat and slid behind the wheel, slamming the door shut. The enclosed space of the car felt like a trap, a coffin. Her hands shook so violently she could barely fit the key into the ignition. She could see the two men in her rearview mirror. They had reached the garage. One of them kicked the crooked door, which flew open and slammed against the wall. They were inside. They would see the open trunk, the missing sacks. They would know she had the evidence. They would come for her next. Her breath hitched in a sob of pure terror. "Turn it on, Elena. Start the car." Joachim's voice yelled from outside. His words were a lifeline. She turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died. A strangled cry of despair escaped her lips. "Tainaku, no, please," she whispered, a frantic prayer to the dashboard. She tried again. The starter motor groaned, a long, agonizing sound that seemed to echo through the entire park. The two figures re-emerged from the garage, moving faster now. They had seen, they knew. One of them pointed in her direction. They had spotted her car. "Please," she begged, turning the key one last time. The engine caught. It roared to life with a protesting clatter of old, worn parts, but it was running. At the same moment, her phone rang, the shrill noise making her jump. It was Joachim. She fumbled to answer it, pressing the speaker button. "They're coming for you," his voice crackled. "Do not take the main road. Turn left, now, behind the long warehouse with the green roof. Go!" The thugs were breaking into a run, their heavy boots pounding on the asphalt. She slammed the car into drive, the transmission groaning in protest. The tires spun on the loose gravel, kicking up a shower of stones, before they finally found purchase. The car lurched forward, away from the coffee stall, and she swerved left, into the deep shadows between two enormous, decaying warehouses. Her rearview mirror was a terrifying tableau of bobbing, angry headlights as the thugs scrambled back into their truck. They were coming after her. The path between the warehouses was narrow and littered with debris. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard it hurt. Joachim's voice on the phone was her only guide in the darkness. "Keep going. The path will open up. Watch for the fallen water tower on your right." The car bounced and scraped over potholes and rusted metal scraps. In the back seat, Mia was crying loudly, a sound of pure terror that tore at Elena's heart. Leo was silent, his small body rigid with fear, clutching the phone for her. The roar of the truck's engine was getting louder behind them. The narrow alley opened into a vast, moonlit clearing dominated by the skeletal remains of collapsed structures. The truck burst out of the alley behind her, its powerful engine a hungry roar in the night. It was gaining on her fast. "I see it! The water tower!" she yelled into the phone, her voice cracking with panic. "Good. After the tower, a sharp right. The fence is broken. It leads to the old highway access road." Joachim's voice was calm, a steady anchor in the storm of her terror. The truck was almost on her tail now, its headlights filling her entire car, blinding her. She felt a massive, jarring impact from behind. The truck had rammed her. The world exploded in a screech of tortured metal. Her head snapped back against the headrest, and for a second, black spots danced in her vision. Mia screamed, a high-pitched shriek of pain and fear. Elena fought the wheel, the car swerving wildly, threatening to spin out. She regained control just in time to see the gap in the fence Joachim had described. It was a narrow opening, a dark promise of escape. Another violent slam from behind. This one was harder, sending her car skidding sideways towards a pile of collapsed concrete. The sound of metal grinding against metal was deafening. Her car was dying. She could feel it in the shuddering of the frame, the sluggish response of the engine. The truck was playing with her, herding her like a wounded animal. Leo cried out, "Mom! They're right there!" She could see their faces now in her side mirror, grim and emotionless, illuminated by her own dashboard lights. There was no rage, just cold, methodical purpose. They weren't trying to stop her. They were trying to kill her. A surge of pure, primal adrenaline shot through her. Not here, not like this. Her children would not die in this forgotten graveyard. With a guttural scream that was part rage and part terror, she stomped on the accelerator. The old engine screamed in protest, but it gave her one last burst of speed. She wrenched the wheel hard to the right, aiming the nose of her battered car for the dark gap in the fence. The car smashed through the remnants of the broken chain-link fence with a sound of tearing metal. Branches and weeds scraped violently along the sides of the car as she bumped onto a narrow, overgrown strip of asphalt. She was on the access road. For a heart-stopping second, she thought she was free. But then, the truck came crashing through the fence right behind her, its larger frame tearing a huge new hole. It was faster, more powerful, and the narrow access road gave her no room to maneuver. The road ahead was dark, a tunnel of overgrown trees. "I'm on the road, Joachim. He's still behind me," she screamed into the phone. "Keep going. It's less than a kilometer to the main highway. Don't let him push you off the road." The truck rammed her again, a brutal, deliberate impact aimed at her rear wheel. She felt the car's back end lose traction, fishtailing wildly on the crumbling asphalt. She was losing control. The world outside the windshield became a terrifying blur of dark trees and streaking moonlight. The steering wheel was useless in her hands. The car was skidding, turning, sliding sideways down the narrow road. The headlights of the truck loomed in her side window now, huge and blinding like the eyes of a great beast. She braced for the final, crushing impact. She could hear her own frantic, ragged breathing, Mia's terrified sobs, the pounding of her own heart. Time seemed to slow down, stretching into an eternity of screeching tires and the certain knowledge of her own death. The truck was preparing to T-bone her, to push her off the road and into the deep, dark ditch that ran alongside it. In that last suspended moment, her eyes fell on the sack sitting on the passenger seat, the ledgers, the proof, the story of Isaias and all the other forgotten men. It couldn't die here. It couldn't end in this ditch. With a final, desperate instinct for survival that came from somewhere beyond fear, she wrenched the steering wheel in the direction of the skid, a maneuver she'd seen in a movie once, a complete long shot. The tires shrieked, but they caught. The car snapped back into alignment with a violent jolt that threw them all against their seatbelts. She had overcorrected. The car was now veering sharply towards the other side of the road, towards the ditch on the left, but in that split second she saw it. Up ahead, the darkness ended. She could see the glow of streetlights, the flash of passing headlights. The main highway, it was right there, 50 meters away. The truck, surprised by her maneuver, had lost a precious second of momentum. It was her only chance. Ignoring the ditch, ignoring the screaming of her engine, ignoring everything but that distant glow, she floored the accelerator. The car shot forward, a wounded animal's final, desperate sprint. She could hear the truck's engine roaring as it closed the distance again, but it was too late. Her car burst out from the overgrown access road and onto the smooth, wide asphalt of the highway, swerving into the slow lane directly in front of a massive semi-trailer. The truck driver laid on his horn, a deafening blast that filled the night. The thugs in the truck were forced to brake hard, unable to follow her out into the path of the oncoming semi without causing a massive multi-car pileup. Elena looked in her rearview mirror and saw their truck swerve to a stop at the edge of the access road, its headlights momentarily illuminating the furious, frustrated face of the driver. They were stuck. They couldn't risk a public spectacle on a busy highway. For now, she was safe. She was out in the open, surrounded by the mundane traffic of the real world. A world of commuters and families and truck drivers. She was just another car on the road. A wave of relief so powerful it was nauseating washed over her, leaving her weak and trembling. She was shaking uncontrollably, her hands gripping the steering wheel in a death grip. In the back, Mia's terrified sobs were slowly quieting, replaced by hiccuping breaths. Leo was silent. "Mom," he finally whispered, his voice small and shaky. "Are we safe?" Elena opened her mouth to answer, but no sound came out. She just kept driving, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, the address on the napkin a burning sigil in her mind. The voice of Joachim crackled over the phone, which had fallen to the floor. "Elena, Elena, are you there? Did you make it?" Leo picked it up. "We're on the highway," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. The truck stopped. There was a long sigh of relief on the other end of the line. "Thank God," Joachim breathed. "Don't stop driving. Get to the address I gave you. Dr. Arantes is expecting you. I called her. She knows you are coming. She knows what you are carrying." The words were a balm on Elena's raw nerves. A plan, a destination, a friendly face. She wasn't just running anymore. She was running towards something, towards help, towards justice. She followed the signs for the city center, her old car rattling and groaning, a wounded soldier carrying a vital message from the front lines. The adrenaline began to fade, and in its place, a deep, bone-aching exhaustion began to set in. But beneath the exhaustion, a new feeling was taking root, a hard, cold, unyielding resolve. Alves had tried to kill her. He had tried to kill her children. This was no longer just about the ghosts in the ledger. It was personal now. She drove through the sleeping suburbs and into the heart of the city, the streets becoming brighter, more populated. The industrial park felt like a nightmare from another lifetime. She found the address Joachim had given her, a modest, older building sandwiched between a closed bookstore and a laundromat. A single light was on in a second-floor window. The office of Dr. Arantes, human rights lawyer. She parked the car, its battered frame a testament to the battle she had just survived. She turned off the engine, and the sudden silence was a blessing. For a moment, she just sat there, her head resting against the steering wheel, her body trembling with the aftershocks of terror. She had made it. She had survived. She looked at the sack on the passenger seat. The ledgers were safe. The diamonds were safe. The story was safe. Taking a deep, ragged breath, she gathered her strength. She woke a sleeping Mia, helped her and Leo out of the car, and pulled the heavy sack from the passenger seat. This was the next step. She was no longer a victim. She was a witness, and she was about to deliver her testimony. The front door of the building was unlocked, as Joachim had said it would be. The stairwell was dimly lit and smelled of old paper and floor polish. Every creak of the wooden stairs made her flinch, the paranoia still clinging to her like a shroud. She clutched the sack to her chest, her children huddled close behind her. She reached the second floor and saw the door, a simple, frosted glass panel with black lettering, Dr. Isabella Arantes, Advocacia. She raised a trembling hand to knock, but before her knuckles could touch the wood, the door swung open. A woman stood there. She was in her 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, and greying hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore no makeup, and her clothes were simple and practical. She looked at Elena, at the terrified children, at the bulky sack clutched in her arms. Her expression was a mixture of deep empathy and grim determination. "You must be Elena," the woman said, her voice calm and strong. "Joachim told me you were coming. Please, come in. You are safe here." Elena stepped across the threshold, and as the door closed behind her, she felt a profound, invisible weight lift from her shoulders. She was in a small, cluttered office filled with towering stacks of books and files. It was a fortress of paper, a bastion of the law. Dr. Arantes led them to a small seating area, taking the heavy sack from Elena's arms and placing it on her desk as if it were a holy relic. She then knelt down in front of the children, her stern face softening. "You two have been very brave," she said softly. "There is milk and cookies in the kitchen through that door. Why don't you go have some? You are very safe now." Leo, after a moment's hesitation and a look at his mother, took Mia's hand and led her towards the kitchen. The moment they were gone, Elena's composure, held together by adrenaline and sheer will, finally shattered. A great, shuddering sob escaped her, and she collapsed into a chair, her body shaking uncontrollably. All the terror, all the pain, all the impossible choices of the last 24 hours came pouring out in a flood of silent, agonizing tears. Dr. Arantes didn't say a word. She simply placed a box of tissues on the table beside Elena and waited. She let her cry, understanding that the tears were a necessary release, a purging of the poison of fear. The office was quiet, the only sounds the ticking of a wall clock and the muffled sounds of the children in the kitchen. The ticking was a steady, calming rhythm, a contrast to the frantic, panicked drumming of her own heart just a short time ago. Slowly, the storm inside Elena began to subside. The convulsive sobs quieted into ragged breaths. She wiped her eyes, feeling hollowed out, exhausted, but strangely calm. The immediate threat was gone. She was in a safe house, a sanctuary. She looked up at Dr. Arantes, who was watching her with an expression of deep, unwavering compassion. "He tried to kill us," Elena whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Dr. Arantes nodded slowly, her expression hardening. "I know," she said, her voice low and filled with a cold, controlled anger. "He has tried to kill many people, but this time," she said, her gaze moving to the sack on her desk, "this time we are going to kill his empire." The lawyer walked over to her desk and carefully emptied the contents of the canvas sack. The rough, uncut diamonds spilled out, creating a glittering, surreal pile on the dark wood of her desk. They caught the light of the desk lamp, throwing tiny, fiery rainbows around the cluttered office. But Dr. Arantes barely glanced at them. Her entire focus was on the leather-bound ledgers. She picked one up, her fingers tracing the worn cover with a reverence Elena understood completely. "Joachim has been talking about these books for 30 years, she said softly, almost to herself. "He called them the Books of the Dead. I always thought it was just the grief talking. I never imagined they were real." She opened the first ledger, her sharp eyes scanning the neat, precise handwriting, the columns of names, the chilling annotations. Elena watched her, her own exhaustion forgotten, replaced by a tense anticipation. She was watching justice, dormant for decades, slowly begin to wake. The ticking of the clock was no longer just a sound. It was a countdown, not for her death but for the end of Antonio Alves. Dr. Arantes read for what felt like an hour, her expression growing grimmer with every page she turned. The silence in the office was absolute. She handled the ledgers with the careful precision of an archaeologist, handling a priceless, fragile artifact. She read excerpts aloud, her voice a low, steady monotone that gave the cold, bureaucratic words of the ledger a chilling gravity. June 1983, account closure. Valdemar Ribeiro. Reason: incident during blasting. She shook her head. Blasting. A convenient way to make a body disappear forever. She turned a few more pages. September 1984. Sector Delta. Medical supplies requisition, 0. Weekly payroll disbursement reduced by 12%. Note: fever outbreak contained. Her eyes, cold with fury, met Elena's. He didn't even give them medicine. He just let them die and docked their pay from the books. The sheer calculated cruelty of it was staggering. This wasn't just murder, it was a business model, a machine for turning human lives into stones, with every variable calculated for maximum profit and minimum cost. Finally, she closed the last ledger and looked at Elena. "This is it," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of horror and elation. "This is the smoking gun. It's more than Joachim or I ever dreamed of finding. It doesn't just link Alves to the land grab. It proves the forced labor. It proves the murders. It names the victims. It names the enforcers." She stood up and began to pace the small office, her movements filled with a new, ferocious energy. With this, and Joachim's testimony confirming his brother's identity from the lists, and your testimony about the threats and the attack tonight, we have enough. She stopped pacing and looked at Eleanor, her eyes burning with intensity. We have enough to go federal. We can bypass the corrupt local system entirely. We can take this to a prosecutor in Brasilia who isn't in Alves's pocket. We can take him down, all of him. His companies, his political connections, his entire legacy. The promise in her voice was immense. A tidal wave of justice that had been building for 30 years and was finally about to crash down. Elena felt a flicker of hope so fierce and bright it was almost painful. Dr. Arantes didn't hesitate. Before the echo of her promise had faded in the cluttered office, she was on the phone. Her voice was a low, urgent murmur, a stark contrast to the chaos of the past few hours. Eleanor listened, her body humming with a mixture of profound exhaustion and electric tension. As the lawyer spoke in Curtis-coded phrases to a contact deep within the federal government in Brasilia, the sounds of the city outside, a distant siren, the hum of late-night traffic, seemed to belong to another world. This small, book-filled office had become the silent epicenter of a legal earthquake. Elena could feel the immense, invisible gears of the state beginning to turn, grinding slowly but with unstoppable force, all set in motion by the discovery in a rusty trunk. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and brewing coffee, a smell of sleepless, determined work. She felt a tremor of fear, but for the first time it was overshadowed by a sliver of ferocious hope. She was no longer running from the monster. She was finally terrifyingly hunting him. Their arrival was nothing like the brutal intrusion of Alves's thugs. There was no roaring engine, no violent kicking of doors, just a quiet, authoritative knock on the office door an hour before dawn. Dr. Arantes opened it to two men in plain, dark suits. They were federal police. Their faces were impassive, their movements economical and precise. They didn't speak much, but their presence filled the room with an aura of immense, quiet power that dwarfed even the memory of Alves's menace. One of the agents, a man with tired but intelligent eyes, handled the leather-bound ledgers with the reverence of a museum curator handling a sacred text. He placed each one into a sealed evidence bag. Elena felt her heart pound a frantic rhythm as she watched the books, her curse and her salvation, being taken away. As the agents left as quietly as they had come, she felt a profound wave of relief wash over her, so potent it made her knees weak. The state, the real law, had finally taken the burden from her shoulders. She was no longer a lone witness. She was under protection. The story broke like a dam. By midday, it was a firestorm. Elena watched, mesmerized, from the safety of the lawyer's spare room, as her story was broadcast across the nation. The television screen was a chaotic mosaic of urgent news reports, flashing headlines, and the stern faces of anchors using words like shocking, brutal, and decades-long conspiracy. Alves's face was everywhere, his philanthropic smile now looking like a grotesque, all-predatory sneer next to grainy photos of the garage and maps of the stolen indigenous land. They showed his picture beside a growing list of the desaparecidos, their names finally spoken aloud for the entire country to hear. The sound of his carefully constructed world shattering was a symphony of ringing phones, buzzing news alerts, and the cacophony of reporters shouting questions outside his corporate headquarters. The narrative he had controlled for a lifetime had been hijacked. The blood diamonds, the blood ledgers, had come to light, and the truth was drowning him in its undeniable glare. The arrest was a masterpiece of poetic justice. It didn't happen in a quiet office or at his fortified mansion. The federal agents, moving with coordinated public precision, walked into the grand municipal theater in the middle of the annual Philanthropist of the Year gala. The air, which moments before had been filled with the sound of a string quartet and the delicate clinking of champagne glasses, fell into a sudden, shocked silence. Alves was on stage, accepting an award, his face bathed in a warm spotlight. As the agents approached, his smile faltered, replaced by a mask of disbelief and then cold fury. The lead agent's voice was calm and clear, amplified by the microphone, as he read the charges. Racketeering, land theft, conspiracy to commit murder. The click of the handcuffs snapping onto Alves's wrists was a sharp, metallic sound that echoed through the vast, silent hall. The only other noise was the frantic, explosive volley of camera flashes, capturing the final, humiliating collapse of a titan for the world to see. In the weeks that followed, the true scale of the horror was unearthed. Forensic teams, guided by the ledgers, began excavating the remote patches of land designated Sector Gamma and Sector Delta. Eleanor and Joachim watched the somber news reports together in Dr. Arantes's office. The sounds were not of chaos, but of methodical, grim work. The low beep of ground-penetrating radar, the careful scrape of shovels against hard earth, the respectful silence of the workers as the first of the shallow graves were found. For Joachim, it was the end of a 30-year vigil. As the name Isaias was confirmed among the identified remains, he didn't weep loudly. He simply closed his eyes, and a single, silent tear traced a path through the deep wrinkles on his face, a quiet closing of an ancient wound. Elena felt an immense sense of gravity, of closure. She had not just found a treasure, she had given these men their names back. She had brought them home from the darkness of Arthur's ledger and into the light of memory and justice. The legal resolution of the diamonds was a surreal postscript to the horror. In the quiet, sunlit office that now felt like a second home, Dr. Arantes explained the law. The diamonds, having been illegally obtained and then abandoned by Arthur, were officially declared tesoro achado, treasure found. As the legal owner of the property where they were discovered, Elena was entitled by federal law to a finder's fee amounting to a significant portion of their appraised value. The lawyer slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was an official valuation from the government. The number written on it had so many zeros that Elena's mind couldn't process it. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and the sound of the lawyer's calm voice seemed to recede. It was a sum that didn't just represent wealth, it represented a different reality, a different universe. Her heart hammered in her chest, not with fear, but with a terrifying, breathtaking vertigo. This number was a wall, separating her old life of quiet desperation from a future she could not even begin to imagine. Her first act as a wealthy woman was achingly small. She walked into the brightest, cleanest pharmacy in the city. The air smelled sterile and faintly of perfume, a world away from the mold and rot of the garage. She walked to the counter, her hands not trembling for the first time in months. She asked for Leo's medicine, and when the pharmacist offered 2 brands, she said, without hesitation, "The best one you have." She also bought vitamins, new toothbrushes, expensive soap, and a fluffy towel. At the register, the total came up, a sum that would have been a catastrophe just weeks ago. She handed the cashier a debit card, connected to an account that still felt like a dream. The machine beeped softly, approvingly. There was no panic, no mental calculation, no shame. As she walked out, the plastic bag, heavy with simple, vital things, felt like the most profound luxury in the world. Her stomach didn't hurt from hunger. It was the first day, in over a year, she hadn't felt the gnawing ache of poverty. It was the first day she felt truly free. The stiff paper in her hand was not an eviction notice. It was the deed to a house. A small but beautiful house with a wide porch and a large backyard shaded by a sprawling mango tree. The contrast was so sharp it was almost painful. Instead of the suffocating silence of her old apartment, this new, empty house was filled with the echoing laughter of her children as they ran from room to room, their voices bouncing off clean, freshly painted walls. The air smelled not of damp and decay, but of sawdust and new beginnings. Later that week, movers delivered her few possessions. Among them was her old sewing machine. As they set it up near a large, sunny window overlooking the garden, she ran a hand over its smooth, familiar surface. It was no longer a dusty monument to a life she had lost. It was a tool, ready to create again. It was a thread connecting her past to a future that was now a vast, brilliant, and unwritten canvas. She was not just a survivor. She was a creator, a builder, a mother in a home that no one could ever take from them. But the transformation wasn't just hers. The wealth born from blood had to be consecrated with justice. Working with Dr. Arantes and a deeply peaceful Joachim, Elena used a substantial part of her fortune to establish the Isaias Foundation, dedicated to land rights and educational support for the indigenous communities Alves had ravaged. She sat in a clean, modern meeting room, not as a victim asking for help, but as a benefactor offering it. Across the table, the leaders of the Guajajara people, men and women with dignified faces and watchful eyes, listened as she and Dr. Arantes laid out the plan. The sound in the room was not of threats or fear, but of collaboration, the quiet shuffle of legal documents that returned land, the murmur of voices discussing scholarships, the ceremonial handshake that sealed a new partnership. The blood diamonds, once a symbol of greed and death, were being transmuted. Their value was being used to irrigate the very ground from which they were stolen, nurturing the roots of the community that had paid the highest price. Elena stands in a warm, bright kitchen, the air thick with the rich, savory scent of roasting chicken and garlic. It is a stark contrast to the stale, unhungry air of the two-room apartment where her journey began. Her hands, once cold and empty, are now deftly setting a large wooden table with colorful plates. The sound is not the pathetic clink of her last few coins, but the happy clatter of silverware as Mia helps, her laughter echoing through the house. Leo, his cough long gone, his cheeks full and rosy, runs in from the yard, shouting about a goal he scored. Elena feels a surge of love so powerful and peaceful, it settles deep in her bones. This is her redemption, not the money in the bank, but this noise, this warmth, this security, this simple, sacred act of feeding her healthy, happy children in a home built on the foundations of justice. She has not only survived, she has created a world of safety and abundance from the ashes of despair. Stories like Elena's show us that even in the deepest darkness, courage can ignite a light that changes everything. If you believe in the power of truth and want to hear more stories of justice and redemption, make sure you subscribe to our channel and become part of this journey.